why don't you please introduce yourself to everybody?
Kim, thanks so much for having me on. I'm Mita Malik. I'm a Wall Street Journal best-selling author of my book, Reimagined Inclusion. I'm the head of DE&I at Carta. I'm a business leader, and most importantly, I'm a mom.
I hear that. So thank you for being on. I can't wait to have this conversation with you. And I'm curious, where your path is right now, everything that you just said. What was your path to get to where you are today? What has been your motivator? How did you end up doing this work?
Well, it starts at the beginning. For any Marvel fans out there, I'll share my origin story. I have an 11-year-old son, so we're exploring the Marvel universe together. But I am the proud daughter of Indian immigrant parents. I was born and raised in the US with my younger brother, and I grew up in a time and a place where I knew I didn't belong. It wasn't cool to be Indian. I was the funny-looking, dark-skinned girl with the long, funny-looking braid whose parents spoke funny English until it wasn't funny anymore. I was bullied a lot, both verbally and physically, by my peers. I was painfully shy and introverted. And I also didn't grow up in an Instagram era. So from a young age, because of being introverted and painfully shy, I spent a lot of time alone. I read a lot, I wrote a lot, and I was obsessed with commercials. I loved going to the grocery store and looking at products on shelf and billboards and magazines. And I just wondered, who has the power of the pen and why? Why don't I see more stories of people who look like me being shared? And that drove me from a really young age to really think about storytelling and the responsibility around that. So it's no surprise I went into a long career as a marketer, mostly in consumer product goods. I always joke my husband's the foodie. I am not. I'm all for community and conversation, and I have sold a lot of beauty products in my career. I'm very obsessed with the beauty space and transitioned into chief diversity officer work, but have always been passionate about inclusive storytelling.
And what does that mean? How would you define inclusive storytelling versus more traditional storytelling?
Well, inclusive storytelling starts with who gets a seat at the table. Whether you have a piece of communications you're working on for the CEO, a campaign idea, a product idea, I only see what I see through my lived experience. So the story really comes through my voice and my lens, but I've never experienced something else. I wouldn't even know what that story is. And so you need lots of different life experiences, views, perspectives to really make sure that your story is trying to include as many people as possible. Now, that's also counter to marketing, which is you really want to know your audience well, and you're not all things to all people. But when you think about corporate comms on a larger scale, you think about when you're sending out a piece, is it being culturally sensitive? Is it culturally competent? Are you considering audiences you wouldn't have? And the intent and impact I talk a lot about in Reimagined Inclusion. Like, have you considered how that piece of communication might be received by someone who has a different lived experience than you?
So I was wondering, do you have a story from when you were working in marketing and people were putting forth ideas around Black History Month or Pride Month, or, kind of trying to be culturally relevant, but they were really missing the mark, and the kind of conversations you were having to help push them through?
Oh gosh, how much time do we have? Where do we start? Part of the conundrum individuals face is that these cultural heritage months matter. And at the same time, no one wants to feel like you're checking the box and being tokenistic. So if the only time you as a company decide to communicate, talk to, involve your Black employee resource group is during Black History Month, how do you think, again, that group feels, that community feels? It seems like you're checking the box to get good points on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Yay, I did something for Black History Month. Women's International Day, Pride, Hispanic Heritage Month. I go on and on. But we can all smell through the BS. I mean, we're all consumers, we're all people. When we feel like we're being used or tokenized, we're like, well, that's not how you show up for the rest of the year. It's convenient that you want to do an internal communication or a social media campaign, but that's actually not my lived experience as an employee. And I think so often we forget our employees are a forgotten consumer. We spend a lot of time thinking about how much we're going to sell, who what, when, where, why externally, but we forget about our employees as important stakeholders.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. So how I found you and found your work was through your book. And you wrote Reimagined Inclusion. Debunk. I love a good colon title, by the way.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, check. I grew up doing documentaries in my 20s and stuff, and I always felt this, like a good title needed to have a colon. Yeah. So Reimagined Inclusion, debunking 13 myths to transform your workplace. I'm interested in when you were thinking of writing the book, or what were you seeing in the world or in your work that you thought, I need to write a book about this?
So what had happened over the course of many years, because writing is therapy for me and I really enjoy writing, I had kept career journals, which is similar to journaling, except that I had written the highs and lows of my career and observations I had. And there's a lot of good books on leadership and inclusion out there right now. And I thought, if I'm going to be additive to the marketplace, I wanted to take a different point of view. I wanted to reach people in a different way. And I actually started to get the idea from reading bedtime stories to my children at night. And I thought to myself, what are the stories we tell ourselves at work that aren't true? And if you hold on to these stories and think they're true, it actually stops us from making meaningful progress. And my son said to me, well, Mom, why 13? And I'm like, there's no science behind it. It's my lucky number. I was born June 13th. And so I started to structure the book through these myths and commonly held misconceptions that I wanted to debunk. And so I went at it through that approach. And if you follow my writing or follow me on social media, the approach of every title on purpose was to be clickbait, to get people to want to dive into it further, and then to share powerful stories, as we were talking about today, how you communicate. And through the power of storytelling, as so many people came who've read this and said, that exact thing happened to me. Like, I want to think I'm special. I'm not that unique. Like, these stories, I think, resonate with so many people that have reached out from reading Reimagined Inclusion. That happened in my workplace. Well, not surprising. It's happened in many workplaces.
Yeah. And some people, especially leaders, will kind of take it personal, like this is happening. And it's like, well, it's a systemic problem. Yes. Like I was working with a cancer center, and I said, the health inequities that you've been accused of, and people being very unhappy about the unequal treatment and stuff, you are a product of a system. But it's also unfortunately common.
Yes.
As kind of these results of based on the systems on how they've been constructed. So what I wanted to share with you is that I'm a big believer, and this is the key part of the work that I do, is helping communicators understand what DEI actually is. So especially post summer 2020, a lot of communicators did the black squares.
Yes.
And put them out on social, right? And this was the impetus for why I the book with Janet Stovall, The Conscious Communicator, the Fine Art of Not Saying Stupid Shit. That summer was the impetus for me to say, we need to write a book about this, because as more and more of those black squares went up, I was like, you don't know what you're saying.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of work behind, and so there's a say-do gap that's happening here. So and the more and more that I work with communicators, the more and more I see that the communicators who are writing these messages, wanting to do the right thing, thinking that they're doing the right thing around pride, saying love is love, and here's a wristband and all these kinds, they literally think they're doing the right thing. Yeah. Like they're showing up and they're being allies. And so who are in communications, in corporate communications, look like me, Mita. They look like me. They don't have the lived experience. Mm-hmm. They don't really understand what are we trying to solve for in DEI. And a lot of our communication teams aren't collaborative partners with the DEI team, if there is a DEI team, if there is a DEI strategy.
Yes. Yeah.
Because if there isn't, you just turn to brand marketing and comms and saying, hey, do something for pride. They become the DEI office.
Yes.
And if they don't have lived, so what I'm trying to get at is that they don't truly understand what DEI is trying to solve for, what the issues are, and then therefore how to tell the story about it. So when you included in your title the debunking the 13 myths, the myths are a big, big problem for communicators who just landed this work that they were ill-equipped and not necessarily resourced, because they don't have the teams, they didn't have the infrastructure, they don't have the relationships, they don't have the experience to talk about this in a way that they truly understand what the point of DEI work is. So before we get into some of the myths that I'd love to dive deeper into when it comes to DEI, that, you know, kind of your Uber narrative around, you know, transcending the myths. And what's the point of the myths? You know, why are there these myths in the first place?
They're comfortable to hold on to. Let's hold on to the myths. In some cases, we hold on to the myths because we actually don't want to make change. Let's just call that out. And in other cases, we don't know any better. It's what we've been taught and told, and we just accept it to be true. And in other cases, it's not intentional. And I love what you were sharing earlier about communicators. There's so much humility in leadership that's needed, but particularly in communication. So if you are the person who's handed the task and you're in your corporate comms group of writing a note for Pride Month, and you think to yourself, the humility comes in, I actually don't understand this lived experience. I am equipped at communicating, but not understanding the lived experience of this community. So the question is, are you going to ask for help? Are you going to admit that, number one, like you just said? You're going to admit it, one. And number two, ask for help. And whether that's your employee resource group, which I say, your employee resource groups are not your DE&I strategy. Don't continue to go to these individuals to have them educate you for historically marginalized communities and do all the work when it comes to DE&I in your organization. There's ways to partner, though. Like, imagine if I was running Pride and you came to me, Kim, and said, could we co-author this together? How would you feel about that? And I'm perfectly in my right to say, no, I don't feel comfortable. Or I might say, wow, the leader in corporate comms came to me and says she wants to co-author this. That's pretty amazing. Like, I'm excited to do that. And then also, if you don't have the internal resources, hire consultants, ask for help. There are plenty of people in the marketplace who have access to these lived experiences. I always say nothing for us without us. How can you be representing a community in storytelling and a lived experience if you don't have it? Now, that's not to say that I cannot write about Pride. I am on a journey to be an ally for the LGBTQ+ community, and I need help and support to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think, what you were sharing earlier, what sparked within me is that people are unintentionally diversity washing or pride washing. They don't realize it, right? And there's a lot of pressure. I've been in these situations from the top. It's Ramadan. What are we going to say? International Women's Day. You know, Kim, the best stories I have are the same ones, which is it's January 30th. And I get all the pieces of content for Black History Month. Black History Month starts in the US February 1st, every day of every year. Why are we doing things so last minute? Right. And I advise communicators, if you're not ready, sit it out. Sit it out. Wait till next year. Actually do the work, because there's going to be more harm than good if you try to do these things last minute.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're not a part of the community, having the community lead and what that conversation needs to be.
Yes.
You know, it's not all up to us, even if it's in our responsibility, but that co-creative process you were talking about is the key for people who opt in. That is an important point. Don't grab, you know, an Asian person in the hallway saying, hey, May's coming up.
Yes. Please don't do that. Please don't do that.
Please don't do that. All right, let's dive in. I'm just going to give people a sample of some of that clickbait myths chapter naming that you incorporated here. Let me bring it back up. Okay, here we go. All right, so like some of them are just like, you know, made me smile, right? So there's a few that I want to check into, but you know, these are some of the other ones we won't get into. But we protect the assholes because our business wouldn't run without them. I love that. We need more people of color in leadership. Let's launch a mentorship program. Yes, that kills me. So, and there's another one that we won't get too deep into, but I do want to make a comment about your myth number 11. Our ad wasn't racist; it was simply a mistake.
Yes.
Now, I read that chapter, and it reminded me of the documentary made about Abercrombie and Fitch.
Oh, yes.
Have you seen it?
Yes, I have seen it.
Okay. The whole back end of that documentary is all about DEI.
Yes,
it's all about racism in their products.
Absolutely.
Sexism, in their marketing. Had sold basically sex to teenagers by selling clothes as kind of an afterthought. But it was very controlled. They're trying to make very big leaps into being more inclusive in their marketing positioning. But
I watched the documentary a few times. I wrote a piece for Adweek on it, actually. And one of the things I wondered is, I talk about this in Reimagined Inclusion. Listen to the whispers, they are the loudest. Oftentimes, there is someone in the room who has had the courage to say, this makes me uncomfortable. They might not have the language to call out that it is racist, it is sexist, it is homophobic, but they might say something's off. And generally, we tend to ignore those voices. They tend to be more junior. Maybe it's someone from a historically marginalized community. Maybe it's someone who has less privilege or power at work. And so I actually was wondering, Kim, as I watched that, who are the people who tried to stop it, who weren't heard? And again, it is really difficult, particularly if you're from a historically marginalized community and you're the only one and you're a communicator, right, and working on these things, the burden to speak up again and again and again, and to be dismissed and to be ignored, and also to be scolded, right? So the first time I have courage to say, there's colorism in this piece of content, there is racist communication, and that person shuts me down, who is one of the more senior ones in the room, I'm less likely to speak up again. And so I think, and I believe, that people are the ones running the companies. Companies are made up of people, and people make mistakes. And so just like in relationships we have with individuals, it remains to be seen how they will continue to rebuild trust with the consumer. But the documentary was pretty eye-opening. And for many of us who remember seeing the t-shirts, the racist t-shirts, you're like, how are these things out there and in the masses, being sold? It's fascinating. I mean, one of the things I was reading about recently, similar in retail, is what's, happening with Banana Republic, and an interesting piece in Fast Company about why that name hasn't changed and how the company's doing so well right now, because it's sort of a throwback to colonialism and an interesting choices of sort of the safari look and the khakis. And if you actually do the research and history of where that imagery comes from, you're like, but it is appealing to a certain target. And that's one that I'm waiting to watch to see what kind of backlash or anything, especially post the murder of George Floyd, the diversity tipping point of 2020. You see so many brands who have had to contend with their racist roots. Uncle Ben's, Aunt Jemima, I can go on, where people had to actually, the backlash was clear, and it was time for them to move in a different direction. So I'm interested to see, especially with Abercrombie and Fitch, like how it continues, the story goes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's quite eye-opening. I do recommend folks watch that documentary for sure. So here's another myth I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on, is myth number 9. These DEI efforts don't benefit me. My voice as a white man doesn't count anymore. Now, as communicators, we're seeing, Mita, a lot of, maybe you're seeing it as well, we're seeing a lot of very emboldened employees putting stuff in our internal channels that are polarizing colleagues and teams, especially in certain states within the United States. And how do we mitigate that? And how do we work through that? And part of the challenge, I think, that we've had with how we've told the story about DEI is that there has been some unintentional remarginalization. that we actually haven't role modeled inclusion, like actual inclusion. There's been inclusion at the expense of exclusion. And so in our narratives and the way that we're telling the story, so we're seeing that backlash. So I see it as feedback. I see it as, let's plug the holes in the strategy.
Yes.
You know, and we have to relook at how we're talking about DEI and the benefits of it for everybody, you know. So tell me more about that myth and, you know, how you talk about it in the book.
That myth was inspired by so many white men who have been champions for me, allies for me, former bosses, mentors, who have said to me privately, these DEI efforts don't benefit me. Like, this isn't about me. I can't speak up. I don't feel safe speaking up. And so the world of work cannot change without white men, and they must be included in DEI efforts and have a seat at the table. And so there are two things that I think happen. One is that when somebody at work, let's say it's a white man, asks a question about DE&I, and I talk about this in the book, and someone says, well, you should know the answer to that. I can't believe you're asking that. And so having grace and kindness and compassion for each other when we're learning and making mistakes, and not shaming, blaming, demonizing, right? And listen, I believe that like 98% of people have positive intent. And those 2% of people who had negative intent, they will go and seek redemption and move on elsewhere, whether it's the Matt Lauers or Harvey Weinsteins who make the headlines. That's, I believe, not the majority of people. And so that doesn't, when I go back to this point about kindness and compassion, it doesn't mean that you can continue to ask me the same questions over and over again and cause hurt and harm. That's not what I'm saying. But I wish that we would create an environment where we could make mistakes and help teach each other. And I know as a woman of color, there's a burden. Like, how many times am I going to teach you, right? So there's a balance in that. And at the same time, I really go back to the business case for diversity, which there's a lot of debate on that. We don't want to talk about the business diversity case anymore. That's 2010. Like, I can't believe we're having this conversation now again. But listen, if you are a white man who is a CEO, who is leading a company, and I have the privilege to work with many CEOs and founders, inclusion is a competitive advantage, right? And so you think about it from that way and you say, wow, Procter & Gamble, one source, tells us that there's over $5 trillion of spending power with the multicultural consumer. That doesn't include individuals with disabilities, veterans, the LGBTQ plus community, and more. Think about all these dimensions of diversity. Are you serving these communities? There is growth to be had. It just looks through the lens of like, who are you excluding and why, right? So I think that's important. And then you look at, okay, well, are those individuals reflected in my workforce? Like, how am I going to serve these communities authentically if I don't have voices who understand those lived experiences, right? And in the US right now, we know over 40% of individuals identify as non-white. That number is drastically changing. And so if you are canceling your DE&I efforts right now, ask yourself where you might be in 10 years. It's a competitive advantage, full stop. The market has changed. And so you have to really be thinking about, especially as a leader, about your legacy, where you're bringing the business, succession plan. How do you want your C-suite to look different? And so that's the approach I'm taking when it comes to making sure everyone's included in this work.
That's it right there. I love it. Thank you so much for that.
I'm going to keep saying it. You know,
that's our soundbite right there.
I was on stage recently and somebody said to me, I don't want to hear about the business case for diversity again. I said, well, too late. I have the microphone, so I'm going to do it. You can agree. You can disagree with me with kindness and respect, but this is how I'm trying to reach people. Like, there is a huge backlash against DE&I in this country right now. And so we are trying to figure out how to meet people differently and how to get them to understand that in a lot of cases, the DE&I efforts were never set up for success. And so that's part of the backlash. Mm-hmm. But how is this work going to evolve? It can't disappear.
And communicators need to find ways to talk about DEI that's invitational.
Yes, I love that. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Invite people
where they are. That's my job, and it's exhausting, but I do it. I have to meet you where you are. And think about what is it in your story? What is it about your life? What is it about your work experience that's going to get you interested in this work? How can I help you find that? And how can I get you to join me in these efforts?
Absolutely. Because I really believe there's a large population that doesn't agree with the, anti-DEI stuff, but they don't feel welcome
Yes.
with super progressive liberal. There's a homeless population within our organizations that doesn't know where to go and doesn't feel safe.
Yeah.
And so we have to, if you're going to ask people to change, you have to create a space for them, allow them to do so, and be with them through that change. DEI for our organizational cultures and how we run our business.
Absolutely. I wanted to go back to something else you said, Kim, which I think will be helpful for communicators when people are dropping fiery, incendiary, controversial, whatever language you want to use, comments in Slack or email, employee engagement tools. What do you do when they feel like they're not included in these efforts? And part of it is, if you can actually meet with someone and talk to them, a lot of times people are lashing out because they've been hurt or harmed or they've been excluded. That's not necessarily the communicator's job, but certainly in partnership with an HR business partner or a leader to say, Mita, I noticed you posted this. I'd love to have a live conversation about it. And you might actually positively enroll that person in your efforts. Maybe they've just been ignored and excluded. You don't know what's going on in someone's life and why they chose to post that. But oftentimes, if you just take the time to meet one-on-one, you can certainly diffuse the situation and actually use it for something positive.
Okay, friends, we're actually going to pause the conversation right here. I know it is so good, and it was really building up momentum. You probably hate me right now, but the conversation when we recorded was so good. We just kept going and going. So we're going to split it in the sake of your time and protecting your time. We're going to split this conversation into 2 different episodes. So keep a lookout and find the other half and the other part of this conversation with this guest. I know you're going to love it. So what popped out to you from the conversation? The more conscious communicators in the world, the better the world. So go to communicatelikeyougiveadamnpodcast.com and set up a one-on-one strategy session. And until next time, let's keep taking care of each other.